Hello everyone, welcome to Argolog. Today we're talking about Roman Britain, particularly focusing on the deep connections between the Roman emperors with the island. And it's an honour to once again welcome an extremely knowledgeable guest, the author Tony Sullivan, one of the best authors in our early history. And this interview will be largely guided by Tony's brilliant book, The Roman Emperors of Britain. It's highly recommended by myself, only published in 2024, so really up to date, well researched and informative. Hello, Tony. How's it going?
Hello there, nice to see you again.
For those who haven't seen our previous episodes, could you just introduce yourself to viewers?
Yeah, hi. So I'm Tony Sullivan. I started writing about 7 years ago when I retired, and I started off looking into the evidence for and against King Arthur, and I wanted to do a more sort of factual, down to earth book, fairly looking at the evidence rather than pushing one particular theory. And then I just got into it. I just got into King Arthur's obviously a massive rabbit hole. And I did a book on the battles, just on the famous battle list in the Historia. And then I branched off. I did a book on the history behind the Gladiator film, which I found really fascinating. And then I did one on Anglo-Saxons, and I followed that up with another one, last year's one, the coming of the Saxons. And I deviated slightly, did a book on the Grenfell fire, because I used to be a firefighter. But most of my books, I've done 11 now. Most of them have been on history, mainly either King Arthur, the Romans, or Anglo-Saxons. So this is, I think, my third book on Roman-related stuff. And it come from a pub quiz type question. Someone asked, who is the first Roman emperor that set foot in Britain? Of course, most people would say Julius Caesar, but it's a bit of a trick question because he was never an actual emperor, of course. Although I start with that in my book because it's obviously a sort of fascinating story in itself and a good place to start. And then, of course, a lot of people would say Claudius, as he was the emperor under which the invasion of Britain occurred. But of course, the first actual person who became emperor, which is why it's a bit of a trick question, because he wasn't emperor at the time, of course, because it was Claudius, was Vespasian. Vespasian was a legate, a legionary commander of the Second Legion, one of the four legions that came across in the Claudian invasion. So, and then I started thinking, well, okay, well, if they set foot in Britain, what other emperors? And I sort of went down this rabbit hole. And it turns out there's quite a lot of Roman emperors set foot in Britain. And when you read the Story of Ptolemy, they give a list of emperors of Britain, but they list about 7 or 8 or 9, I believe. Um, so they don't list all of them, but they list some of them. So it's kind of interesting. Well, why have they listed them ones? Why have they listed people like Magnus Maximus? Well, of course, he appears quite a lot in Welsh genealogies. So it just become a bit of a thing, and I thought I make a good book. No one's ever written a book on all the emperors that set foot in Britain. So I pitched it and I accepted it, and there you are.
Okay, so Roman Britain, this is an important part of our history, a formative part, and perhaps relatively well recorded compared to what came before and what came shortly afterwards. So can I start by asking, what are our sources on Roman Britain, and what can we say that we really know, and also what don't we know?
Okay, well we got quite a few sources. So we got quite a few Greek sources before the Romans turned up describing Britain. We think Herodotus mentions the Tin Islands, which you have to say is almost certainly Britain he's talking about. And then there's a few other Greek writers that mention Britain. I think we've got Pythius and Diodorus. He's the first person I think who calls it Britanny. So it started. The first writers referred to it as Britanny, or we are the Britanny, the Britons, and it's Britain. It's not, and it changes to be much later in the first century. And then you've got Julius Caesar himself, wrote a fair bit. We get a lot from that. Obviously, it's a fair bit of propaganda there and self-aggrandizement. And then you get Tacitus, Pliny, Ptolemy, all sorts of early, right? Strabo, and then later on we get Claudian and people like that. But Cassius Dio. So for looking back from say the end of the second century, looking back, perhaps the best sources are Cassius Dio and Herodian, and then you've got Suetonius, obviously 12 Caesars. There's a fair bit of information in there. So we've got quite a good wealth of information there, and it can be a lot of it's corroborated with inscriptions and archaeological evidence. So we have a fair bit of information. What we don't have is things we can't see, which is like the sort of like the feelings of the common man and woman, and how they identified, how they all felt about it, where the political fissures were. Did everyone? Because when Caesar invaded, some tribes were allied to Rome, and you think, well, okay, well, why were they allied to Rome? Were the people in those tribes all happy about that? How did people feel about that? So those sorts of things, and how people felt 100 years later, 200 years later, 300 years later. Well, did they become more Romanized? How did the common people feel? Things like that. It's hard to see, but we can have a good stab at it, and hopefully we will in this talk.
So, what do we know of the earliest contact between the Britons and the Romans?
Right. So we have Julius Caesar. So the first real contact as such we have is Julius Caesar, and Julius Caesar, he became the governor in Gaul. He invaded or Alpine Gaul, I think was his first governorship, and then he invaded Gaul. And then, having captured most of Gaul, he became a bit of a hero in Rome, and also caused a lot of jealousy, which ultimately led to his assassination 10 years later or 15 years later. And then in 55 BC, he writes one of the reasons is that the Britons were helping the Gauls in his war against the Gauls. And importantly, he mentions three tribes in Gaul, one of which is the central bit is the Celtae, and the northern tribes he describes as the Belgi. Atrebates is one of the tribes as well, and of course in southern Britain you've got the Belgi and the Atrebates as well. So and he describes Britain as they speak a similar language, although crucially not exactly the same language. They speak a Celtic. Britain is Brythonic. So we can only guess that it was kind of similar to maybe an Italian might understand a Portuguese person a little bit, or a Spanish person. That kind of, there's a similarity, but they're not the same languages. So he decides to invade Britain in 55. I think it's 55 BC. So I think he had planned to do it early in the summer, but there was an incursion of Germanic tribes across the Rhine, and he has this dramatic story how he intercepts them, defeats them, and he builds a bridge across the Rhine. And this is all done in 18 days. It's amazing. They built a massive bridge across the Rhine, takes his army across the Rhine, destroys much of the other side of the river, punitive like destruction of villages and stuff like that, and then comes back across the bridge and dismantles the bridge, all in 18 days supposedly. And so by this time it's the end of the sort of campaigning season. It's like the end of summer, so it's sort of end of August, I think, September. And he decides he still wants to invade Britain, so he takes 2 legions, I think it is, and a few auxiliary cavalry, in about 300 ships off the top of my head, and he sails to, we think Sandwich, East Kent, Deal type place, Walmer, that kind of area. And they have found a camp, although previously, if you Google it, it will say, you'll find people saying, oh, there's no evidence about exactly where they landed, but actually recently in the last few years they have found a camp which they think might be Caesar's, one of Caesar's camps from one of the 2 invasions. So he invades, so he takes his force to this beach, and he finds the Britons lined up on the beach. So it's a very dramatic scene that he paints, and it kind of does suggest, considering the Britons' leader is said to be this guy called Cassius. He's the chief of the tribe that is basically kind of St. Albans area, the Catabaluni. So that would suggest, given that Britain was a patchwork of tribal groups, that the Britons have come together somewhat. So they may well have been allies of Rome. And in fact, Caesar has got this guy called Cominius on his staff, who's a Briton, and the Britons seem to have come together and formed an alliance. So that gives you some suggestion of the sort of political situation, that it is possible that the Britons were able to come together, Without the Romans, they're probably fighting like rats in a sack. At this particular juncture, they come together and they're on the beach with their cavalry and their chariots and various other things. And the Romans try and storm ashore. And the way that Julius Caesar writes it is almost like it's a very, very close run thing. So the Romans are disembarked. They can't get their ships close into the shore enough. So the soldiers are having to jump into the water and wade ashore. And they're wading ashore. Of course, they can't form up very well, having waded ashore. And they're confronted with the Britons, who are like obviously trying to drive them back in the sea. And they're losing, basically. They're losing. So he orders his ships to get as close as they can and try and hit the Britons with artillery. So they got all these ballista bolts, and which must have been a bit of a shock for the Britons. Imagine a tribe as a ancient Britain, you maybe never had seen artillery before. You're used to fighting in chariots and on horses and on foot. You've probably never seen artillery, and then all of a sudden, from 300 yards away, a bolt of iron comes shooting and impaling one of your comrades. That'd be a bit of a shock. A massive stone comes looping over from an onager on a ship and crushes someone next to you. You'd be a bit shocked by that, I would have thought. And in some of these boats, so later on, it is the 5th century, but there is a report, Siege of Rome, where a Goth is hit by one of these ballista bolts and it impels him to a tree. So, yeah, so you can imagine how powerful these things were. But still, the Britons are at this point winning, if you believe what Caesar's writing. And then you have this dramatic moment where a standard bearer of the, I think it's the 10th Legion, standard bearer, jumps down into the surf with the Legion standard, and says, basically, I'm not going to stand here and watch our comrades be killed. I'm taking the standard, and either you follow me or you lose the standard. So he jumps into the surf and he wades ashore on his own. And of course, the soldiers all jump in and follow him and push the Britons off. They manage to form up, they form a line, they manage to get more soldiers on the beach, and then they eventually drive the Britons off. So the way Caesar writes it, it was like a very, very dramatic close run battle. So they then get ashore and they build a camp, and then the cavalry transports haven't turned up. And he marches inshore, or he sends a party to go inshore to sort of collect resources and wheat. Yeah, wheat. Obviously, there must have been farms and wheat fields. So they've gone ashore to requisition food and whatever they can find, livestock and wood and whatever. So they built this camp, and these couple of cohorts go off, which is about 1,000 men. And while they're off trying to do this, the Britons ambush them, and then there's a sort of cry for help back to the fort, and Caesar himself leads a relief column out to drive off and to save these couple of cohorts, which he does. And obviously he's writing this, so you would expect him, but apparently he was very brave. I mean, there's if you read, I think it's Adrian Goldsworthy's book on Caesar, he was a very brave man. He stood up to Sulla. Sulla basically said, if you don't divorce your wife, I'm going to execute you. And he just said, I'm not going to do it. So, he was a brave man. He was captured by pirates famously, wasn't he? And he sort of like braved his way through that. And when he was ransomed, said to them, I'll be back and I'll kill you all. And they all laughed at him. And he did go back and kill them all. Yeah, he wasn't afraid. At the siege of Alesia, he led sort of a counterattack personally. So he wasn't sort of a timid man, just cowering in the back. He led his men. So anyway, so they get the relief column back to the camp. Meanwhile, the cavalry transports have turned up and have been blown off in a storm. So he hasn't got his cavalry. So they've been blown off in a storm. And when the Britons hear of this, they decide, all right, now's our time. I think they'd taken this sort of like I wouldn't say the surrender, but there was some chieftains from presumably Kent in the camp coming to terms. And when they realised that his transports had been blown off and he was actually in a sticky situation, they all slipped out of the camp, and then the Britons suddenly turn up outside the camp en masse. So he takes his legions out of the camp and he draws them up, and they end up having this pitched battle outside, which the Romans win, because that is their thing, pitched battles. So they drive the Britons off And then if you believe Caesar, he takes hostages. He accepts they accept his terms that he imposes upon them, and he decides to go back. So he's only been there like 6 weeks, I think it is, and he dismantles the camp and takes everyone back. Although he didn't have enough ships, he crams everyone on the ships he's got because they've been destroyed in the storm, and he takes them back on the same night. So if you read between the lines, it's kind of like, rather than I came, I saw, I conquered. It's more like I came, I sort of dabbled, I dipped my toe, I got a bloody nose a little bit, and I decided to scarper before the winter set in. Because if the winter was set in, then he's there all winter with no resources, surrounded by hostile tribes. And you'd wonder, if that had happened, would we even know about Julius Caesar at all? It'd just be a footnote, wouldn't he? If it had lost and got destroyed. So he goes back and he decides the following year he's gonna have another go. So the following year he goes with 4 legions, I think, or 5 legions, I believe it is 5 legions, and a little bit of auxiliary. So the Claudian invasion was 4 legions, but loads of auxiliaries. They had about 20,000 auxiliaries. So he goes with, and this time it's 600 ships, I think it is. Um, so you've got a few thousand auxiliaries and 5 legions. And again, he lands presumably in the same place, Pegwell Bay, they believe, is a little bit further up the coast, and again sets up a camp and then marches inland. And the first battle, we think, is at the River Stour, which is Canterbury, goes into Canterbury. So they make a crossing of the Stour, and he describes a siege of a camp, which I think Bigberry. I think there's a Bigberry camp there. There's a hill fort. They think it might be that one. And he describes taking this hill fort, where the legionaries attack it in using testudo, the old shields above their heads. So all very dramatic. They take the camp and they march inland. And then there's another ambush where they're setting up a camp, and in the middle of setting up a camp, the Britons attack. A tribune is killed, but they fight it off. They set the camp up. So it's all quite amazing. Think about from the Britons' point of view, unless they'd come over to Gaul and helped the Gauls out. But most Britons would have been just in Britain all the time, and wouldn't have travelled very much. This would all be massively new, wouldn't it? I mean, if you think about it, here's an army. First of all, they're not just turning up en masse and having a big brawl and fighting in chariots, wheeling around each other. They're marching in column, very organised. The Britons must have thought, who are these people? And then they turn up. They stop at 2 o'clock and they build a camp. They build a camp. Imagine the first time you saw that happening. You would have thought, what on earth are they doing? They're digging. What? And then within 2 hours, they built a camp. You must think, my God, it took me 2 years to build my farmhouse. They built a camp. So I mean, it's a massive undertaking. But they did this day in, day out, didn't they? They marched, stopped, built a camp, tore it down the next day, and then marched on again, unless they left the garrison behind. And so they get through presumably Kent, and then they make a river crossing. Now there's a massive debate about this, because I think originally people thought it was Westminster or near sort of London. They found the Battersea Shield was found near there, wasn't it, near Battersea?
Yeah.
And they have found like kind of stakes, and they found various things at places along the River Thames. So there was a thought it was thinking that it was on the Thames somewhere, or at Southwark Bridge, where London was, where Londinium was founded. But I think more and more people are thinking it was at the lowest fording point, which apparently is opposite Tilbury. So I imagine, I don't know if you know the area, but I used to live at Dartford, which isn't far. You look across the Thames from Dartford, it's massive. It's the Thames estuary, so it's it doesn't seem like that's doable. But apparently the River Thames was 15 feet or something lower, and at that point, sort of Dartford, Gravesend, that kind of span of the river opposite Tilbury, it would have been lots of like streams and inlets, and there would have been sort of like sandbanks, moving sandbanks, and there would have been a way across it. So it could be there. So they're more and more thinking. The last couple of books I've read, they seem to suggest it might be opposite Tilbury, which makes more sense if you're marching from roughly Pegwell Bay, and you're marching, you'd have probably kept to the coast, the north coast, because then the ships can supply you as you're marching through Kent. And then you get to the Medway. So the first major river is the Medway, and the Medway comes down. You've got Rochester, and then the Medway comes down, and just below Medway you've got a couple of fords. You've got Snodland and Haylen, which you've probably never heard of, and Aylesford, which you might have heard of, because there's a battle in the Historia Petroleum. They mention Vortimer fighting battles, and one of them's at Aylesford, we think, Episford.
Sounds familiar, yeah.
Yeah.
I think I
So,
read it the other day.
and the reason why, and so the only way out of Kent, because the south of Kent, you've got the Weald, which at the time was kind of, well, not impenetrable, but it was quite a thick forest. So you've got the Weald. So your way out of Kent is the first ford over the Medway, which is why we think Vespasian fought a battle there in the Claudian invasion, and why you get battles in the Historia Petroleum and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle at Aylesford and also Cragganford, Crayford. But anyway, so the Romans eventually built a bridge over Rochester. So either, maybe they forded a river further up, or maybe they came down to the first ford and then continued their way and then crossed the Thames, because he finds from his Roman allies, the Britons that were allied to Rome, which we think the Atrebates were, and the southern tribes were more allied to Rome. He finds that
Sorry, can I just ask,
oh,
since we were talking about it, um, they used to think that the fording point was Westminster, right?
yeah,
What was at London at that time? Was it a native settlement at all? Or
no. Well, apparently, so I read, there was nothing there. So the Romans built London on virgin land. Now I think there's old legends about it being originally being called
in
um,
Levantum, is it?
New Troy. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, New Troy. Yeah. But I don't think there's any evidence for that. So as far as we know, now it would make sense for them to build, but then of course York was built. York was built by the Romans on an area of land between the tribes where there was nothing there before. So it's not unprecedented. It's a kind of a Roman thing to do, to pitch up, find a strategically good bit of land between two tribal areas that they can build I don't know, a fort on, and then they can hold that between two tribal areas. Um, so yeah, so yeah, there's no evidence that there was a town there before. So they cross. So now then you get this crossing, and then there's a battle on the other side of the crossing. It's quite similar to the Claudian invasion. And he's discovered that Castellanus, he's got a stronghold. He's been told where his stronghold is, and we think it might be Wheaton, Hampshire, Hamptonshire, which is in Hertfordshire, I think. But of course, it could be. We don't know that for sure. But there is a hill fort there, and I think they found various artifacts where they think, oh, that might be it. So he crosses the river into what is now Essex, which is the Trinovantes area, and he defeats. He has a battle on the other side of the Thames. He defeats the Britons, and he marches further on, and he attacks this hill. It's not a hill fort. It's described as the Britons often, apparently, they're what he calls the Oppida, the Oppidium. Their strongholds were in forests surrounding. They used to cut down logs, and they'd build their strongholds within forests. And again, he attacks this stronghold and manages to break in and defeat and capture all their cattle and get all the people in there and burn it all down. And they again have to come to terms. So they come to terms and they deliver hostages and they agree tribute, which is rather crucial because according to Julius Caesar, they agree all this stuff and they agree to pay tribute, and they're now, according to Julius Caesar, under Roman rule, albeit the Romans don't stay. They have accepted Roman authority, or at least in the southern part of Britain. And then Julius is again, he comes back. Again, I think there's a storm, and he decides to send his army back. They've got just enough ships, they can do it in 2 trips. Um, so I think he sends the cavalry back first. He sends his cavalry back, and something happens to the ships, and he's left with not enough ships and a lot of men. And again, he decides to cram them all in and make a run for it one night because the first group hasn't come back. So the transport ships haven't returned. So he decides to make a run for it. Now, you read between the lines, it does sound, whilst it's like, I won all these battles, I defeated the main opponent, I then came back, and I then returned to Gaul. When you read it, it does sound like he was under some pressure and had to get back rather sharpish. So it's sort of like the sort of September time, end of September, and he needs to get back before the winter sets in. Otherwise, he's stuck there. Um, and it does sound like he was not panicking as such, but he was taking a chance to cram them all in and come and try and get everyone back when the weather wasn't exactly perfect. But anyway, he manages to do that, and he comes back to Gaul, and then you get the whole story about the conquering of Gaul, and 2 years later, you get Vercingetorix, and you get the siege of Alesia and all that, and then a couple of years later, he crosses the Rubicon, and then you get the whole he's made dictator, and then he gets assassinated in 44. So, but according to him, the Britons have now been defeated and are paying tribute to the Romans. So you get this whole thing crop up about, well, what is that true? Is that true? And then you get Augustus or Octavian, who becomes the first emperor. If you read the sources, he does consider invading Britain. And partly because so Gaul seems to be fairly pacified at this point. So it didn't take long to Romanize Gaul, and they're fairly pacified. You don't get like major rebellions in Gaul 100 years later. Um, and there's sort of suggestions that the Britons stopped paying tribute. So whatever the agreement was lasted maybe a couple of decades, and then it kind of broke down. The Romans hadn't come back. The Britons probably thought, well, okay, they're not coming back. They've got their hands full. And so Augustus has considered invading Britain, so for whatever reason. And then he decides I think there's a little bit of problems in the Germania, and either he just he decides it's just not worth it, or he gets assurances. There's an implication that the Britons started basically to pay up, or whatever the agreement was. But it's very, very vague. It's very hard to tell exactly whether Julius Caesar was just sort of over promoting himself, exaggerating, or whether there was some sort of agreement that the Britons finally broke. And then you get the famous bit with so Tiberius was not interested at all. There's no suggestion Tiberius was interested in invading Britain, but Caligula famously marched his troops to the Channel and got them to throw stones into the sea, and said he defeated Neptune, and then got them all to collect seashells, and then turned around and marched back to Rome. So there's that famous. So he was going to. So he collected them all together to invade Britain, and then decided not to. So there's that. So there was this also between Caesar and Claudius. You've got about 80 years. So I mean that's a long time, 80 years. So it's enough time for things to change, political agreements to change. Whatever tribute there was may have kind of like, or agreement they had may have broken down. But there, it's a big undertaking. Julius Caesar, had invaded twice, but he hadn't gained a foothold. He hadn't stayed there. It does kind of be on one. I can't remember which invasion it was, but he talks about being hounded back to the coast by about three or 4,000 chariots, which is a lot of chariots, 3 or 4 thousand chariots. But that's what he says. So the Britons obviously, chariots were a big part of their warfare. And so it wasn't until Claudius. So the reason for Claudius's invasion was more about, I think so the guy who was or the king of the Cantiviluni, Conor Bellin or Conor Berlin, he had two sons, one of which is Caratacus, the famous British war leader. And there's another, the Caratacus' brother, Togmadius, I think it is, Togdemus. And when he died, Caratacus and his brother were much more anti-Roman than their father had been. And I think part of the agreement was that the Cantiviluni wouldn't encroach upon the southern tribes. And it would appear that they did just that they attacked the Atrebates and they attacked the Trinovantes. But the Trinovantes, I mean, so as you'll see, the main town, for want of a better word, or centre of power was modern Colchester, Camulodunum. But that's in Trinovanti territory, but it was controlled by the Cantavellauni. So it seems that either they merged or they basically took over them or whatever. But so the king of the Atrebates, or one of the princes, comes to Rome or comes to Claudius and says, "Can you help me? I'm being attacked by these terrible people." And Claudius says, "Okay, yes." So that's kind of the pretext. But some people have said, well, Claudius needed some sort of military victory. His rule was a bit shaky. Um, it started with the death or the murder of Caligula, and then the Praetorian Guards went absolutely mental and killed loads of people, and found in the melee found Claudius hiding behind a curtain and nearly killed him, but decided not to, and then dragged him back to the camp, and then decided he was their man and they were going to make him emperor. He didn't want to be emperor at all. Um, but then he ended up emperor, and then I suppose he played the part. So he's not exactly as he's portrayed in I Claudius and other films. Apparently, he was a bit bloodthirsty. He liked a gladiator fight. He was a bit. He did stutter, and he had a few physical problems, and he struggled to get up the stairs when he had his triumph. But he did like to watch people be. He enjoyed watching the lights go out when people were killed in the arena. So he wasn't exactly as he's portrayed in some of the films. But he decides he's going to invade Britain. So he organises 4 legions, 900 ships this time, so a much bigger force than under Julius Caesar, 20,000 auxiliaries, and they basically used the fleet that Caligula had gathered, and the town is it Boulogne? I guess here Rickham, I think it's called. So Boulogne was where the fleet was going to set out from. So they prepare that, and that's where they're going to set out from. And they land, we think, in the same place that Julius Caesar landed, roughly. Although we'll get to that. There's a little bit of controversy there, a little bit of debate. Now, Claudius leaves Rome, and he's away from Rome for about 2 months. And so if you sort of, depending who you read, it would seem that Claudius wanted to be part of this, but actually reading between the lines, he was only in Britain for about 14 days, and he came when everything was basically finished. But anyway, we'll get to that. So the Romans, again, they land around about the same place, East Kent, and the Isle of Thanet, the channel between Thanet and Kent back then was much wider. It was 2 miles wide, whereas now it's not. They're connected. Otherwise, it's still called the Isle of Thanet. You'll drive over it into it, and you won't know you've driven onto an island.
Is it the Wonsum Channel, something like
That's it,
that?
yeah. So it was quite wide. So you could sail in there. There's various bays. So Pegwell Bay is one. You could sail in there, and you're completely protected from the North Sea. Anything coming, the sort of the winds and the storms. You're relatively protected. So it's a very good place to land.
You'd go up the Thames then, wouldn't you? You connect to the
Yeah,
Thames.
yeah, and then you go into the Thames estuary. So they land there. They're not contested. They land there, then they come inland, and then I think they get to the Medway when they get the first battle. So they get over the Stour, they get into Kent, and they march. And we think, whilst the Romans, obviously, we know about Romans building roads in Britain and everywhere else, we think there were trackways. The Britons had trackways. I'm not sure you'd call them roads as such in the sense of Roman roads, but there were, it would make sense if the Romans built their roads on pre-existing trackways or way, so we think that there was a reasonable amount of sort of, I don't know what you would call it. There was a
Infrastructure,
trackway.
maybe?
Yeah, like so the Pilgrim's Way, for example. So the Pilgrim's Way, so there's ancient trackways that we think people used for, hundreds, thousands of years before the Romans turned up. They wouldn't have been as extensive and built as the Roman roads were, but there were ways that people went. So the Romans would have followed that, and they got to the Medway, and how far down the Medway we don't know. And we sort of read that the Britons they were sort of spread out on the far bank, assuming they were safe. So they're like unprotected, not really prepared. And so the Romans sent across the Batavians, and the Batavians apparently, a Germanic auxiliary group, they could swim in full armor. So they in their mail coats, they could swim across in their mail coats carrying their equipment. That was their thing. So they were kind of elite Navy SEAL type characters, and they swam across and they managed to hobble all the horses and basically make a foothold. And then the legion came across, and the second Augusta came across with Vespasian in charge. And so there was a big battle on the other side of the Medway, and it's again that very close run thing. Vespasian and the Second Legion were nearly destroyed. They were saved by the arrival of a Second Legion who came over and drove the Britons off. So, and it was this guy, I think his name was Geta, who was the legate of this other legion. It doesn't say which legion, and he's the one who got the laurels, so the triumph. He's the one, not Vespasian. So it seemed that he was the hero of the day. And then the Britons came back the next day, and there was further battles, and then they were driven, and then they retreated, and they've again got to the Thames. Then again you have this crossing of the Thames, which again they think is Tilbury, but they're not sure exactly. And they get across, and then intriguingly, they get across the Thames, and the Romans follow them. And intriguingly, it says the Romans went further along the coast and crossed the bridge. Now, it doesn't say who built the bridge. It doesn't say the Romans built the bridge. They may well have done. They may well have put across a pontoon bridge. And as we know from Caesar, they could build a bridge pretty quickly. Whether they could do it under fire, I don't know. But they were able to build a bridge. But it doesn't say the Romans built it. So maybe the bridge was already there. Yeah,
So
maybe
that
the
would be a
Romans.
native bridge then.
Then it'll be a native bridge, which is an interesting thing, I think, you know. But
So would
anyway,
that be where Southwark is then? Is that right?
well, this is it. So we don't know that. So there was people did think it was Southwark because I think people assumed that they built London near where they crossed the river. I think people assume that, but we don't know that, and so people are saying, well, maybe the crossing again was where Caesar crossed because it's the lowest fording point. So you'd get your ships across, you'd get your ships in, and the ships need a certain draft. Again, this is all speculation because, of course, ships could sail up the Thames, can't they? But they're saying in those days, because the Thames was lower, the ships couldn't get as close in
Okay.
and fire their artillery or whatever they had. So they think possibly Tilbury. But of course, later on, London was built there because you could get ships to London. You know, you could get ships. So
Yeah.
so when it became a commercial centre, you could get trading ships down there. So it wasn't impossible to get ships all down the Thames, obviously.
So
Um,
as I understand, London was kind of developed in quite an ad hoc way, maybe.
yeah, yeah, that's right. I don't think it didn't even have walls at first, did it? So, and it was more a trade. It was more a commercial centre at first. It wasn't a military centre. So they built forts in various places, but London was more commercial than it was military. Um, and then like, later on that all changed. Um, so anyway, so they get across. They get across this. They get across this bridge. They get across the other side, and they make this frontal crossing. And then the Britons are attacked from three sides, so they didn't have to retreat into the marshes, um, which again is more likely Essex, I guess. You know, if they're talking about marshland, and the Romans, some of the Romans follow them, and they come a cropper. The Romans suffer a bit of a setback there. The soldiers that follow them don't come back basically. So whilst they've won and they've got a foothold north of the Thames now, um, it's not, you know, the Britons aren't defeated. They're still a force. Now, at this point, they stop. So the general in charge, Paulus, was it? Paulus, I think it was. He stops and he supposedly sends for help. He needs Claudius to help him. And Claudius then comes across. Now, reading between the lines and looking at other sources, it's more likely that, oh, right, we won now. We're now going to enter Dunham, and we want the emperor to enter. So Claudius turns up. They march northeast, and they enter. No battles, and the sources say he didn't fight a battle. They enter what is now Colchester, and Dunham it's quite a big area. It's like the size of Heathrow Airport, so it's a massive area. And there's earthen banks protecting it, but it's more like you've got farmsteads dotted about. It's not like a city or a town the way we think of it. But the Romans enter that, and he takes. I think there's an arch in Rome, where Claudius takes the plaudits, or the surrender of 11 chieftains. And then there's a whole thing about who these chieftains are. One of them is the father of Boudica, we think. And one of them is the famous guy from the Fishbourne Palace in Chichester.
Oh, that's the Toggy Debnus, is it?
Yeah. So there's various people we know, possibly Kent. So there's various clues of who these guys will be. Now, the other thing we do, before I forget, the other thing, interestingly, is the Romans, as they're marching north and they're pushing Caratacus. So his brother dies in one of the battles. We think the one at the Thames. He's not mentioned after that. So Caratacus is now the leader of the Britons. The Romans take we call it surrender or alliance of the Deboni, which are on the west bank of the Severn. So some people have thought, well, okay, well, that's a bit odd, isn't it? Why would they either some tribes from other parts of Britain have seen the writing on the wall and have decided before they even get there, we're going to be on the side of the Romans, or actually some people have suggested perhaps the Romans landed further west and marched up from the southern coast and came in that way. So some people suggest that, but most people, I think, most historians are with because the Domitian built an arch where they landed, and it was in Richborough, which is near Sandwich, near Deal. So we think it was that, but perhaps there was another arm of the army marched from the south coast that we don't know about, and as they're marching, they're taking representations from the tribes they're passing near to.
Yeah, that's quite plausible.
So anyway, so this happens, and there's this story about Claudius entering what is now Colchester on an elephant, which is again would be quite a thing for the Britons to see because they've obviously never seen an elephant. But interestingly, it may not have been the first elephant in Britain because one of can't remember the guy's name, but not someone you've heard of probably, but one of the sources talks about Julius Caesar bringing an elephant and using it, an armored elephant with a tower and archers on its back, using it to cross a river and defeat the Britons on the other side. We don't know if it's the first invasion or the second invasion. Sounds like the second invasion. And again, you'd think, well, the Britons would have taken one look at that and thought, what the hell is that? And horses famously are rather scared of elephants, but they're really terrified of elephants. So if your major sort of offensive force is cavalry or chariots, an elephant coming at you is gonna bugger that up a bit. So so it is possible that Julius Caesar bought an elephant, but he doesn't mention it. But another writer mentions it. So that's quite interesting. So so you get this story. So Claudius has turned up with an elephant and has entered Colchester on his elephant, and he's taken. You can imagine the Britons are all there. The kings are there. Some of them allied. Some of them have been forced to be allies. Some of them have surrendered, and they see Claudius coming in his regalia on top of an elephant, followed by the might of Rome marching in. So, and then he goes back. So he spends about 2 weeks in Britain, and then he goes back, and he's back in Rome within a month. And he has a triumph, and he has to be helped up the steps and stuff like that. So then I mentioned he likes a good gladiator show. So the Romans put on various shows, and one of which apparently is a siege of a British town or British hill fort, and the Romans take this British hill fort, and so we think that is Vespasian marching west, which we're going to come to in a minute, because he actually does take a number of hill forts. And Vespasian, interestingly, a slight going off at a tangent, he's the guy at one of his shows where the famous phrase, "Those who are about to die salute you." It's only actually said once, and it's said to Claudius at a naval engagement. So he goes outside. It's not in Rome. Outside Rome, there's a big lake, and they set up this massive show, basically, with various boats, warships, and they have thousands of gladiators and slaves to fight this mock battle as entertainment. And before they fight the battle, they say to Claudius, or a group of them say, "Those are about to die salute you." That's where that phrase comes from. So anyway, so Claudius goes back, and then the first governor of Britain, Paulus, I think it is, um, he he commands Vespasian to take one legion and some auxiliaries and head west, which he does. So Vespasian then leads this legion westwards. He hugs the coast. It says he takes the Isle of Wight, so he captures the Isle of Wight, and then he takes various Oppidium, so sort of 20 towns. It says he takes 20 towns, which you can only think is hill forts. So he besieges 20 hill forts, and he basically he forces the surrender of two tribes. So the question is, who are those tribes? Where are those hill forts? All we know is he marched west, and it's more west than the Isle of Wight. That's all we know. So it sounds like the Durotriges and maybe the Dumnonii, or maybe it was the Belgae, or maybe the Atrebates seems to have been allied to Rome. So two, almost certainly Durotriges, and then it's probably the Belgae. It could be the Dumnonii, we don't know.
So that part of the conquest was quite quick then.
It was, yes. So Vespasian was in Britain for about 4 years. So the initial part of the conquest was very quick, and then you get the Vespasian's campaign westward. I'm not sure it says how long he took, but 47, he's back in Rome, getting his triumph and his laurels and stuff. 47, 48. So as he's going west, we think Maiden Castle was one. So we've got sort of some evidence of some there's some bodies and there's bolts and various things at Maiden Castle. So again, you have to think that the Britons would not have experienced this, and the hill forts that the Britons had, they weren't all necessarily designed to live in as such. They were a place you went when there was trouble. So you would have had your hill fort. Maybe the chieftain's hut was there, and various people did live there, but there have been lots of farms all around, weren't there? And then if you was attacked, you brought all your people, a bit like Helm's Deep in Lord of the Rings. Once you're attacked, you bring all your people into a place of safety. And you must think this must have worked for centuries as the tribal conflict was going on between various tribes. It must have worked reasonably well, or I wouldn't have spent so much time digging trenches and building hill forts. And then the Romans rock up with artillery, and you must have sat in your hill fort and thought, "Well, we're safe here. What on earth?" But what on earth are they doing down there? They seem to be building something. They seem to be building lots of things that I've never seen before, and all of a sudden, bolts and rocks start coming in and going through your wooden palisade. It must have been a bit of a shock. So I think as the word got round that this was happening, and the Romans were very quickly taking these hill forts, you might have thought the last few might have capitulated quite quickly. Who knows? But he seems to have taken 20 hill forts and two tribes, and we don't. Maybe he did it in a whole season. Who knows? But I did try and calculate it in my book. I did a book on Vespasian, and I did. If he did it in a season, he could rock up at a hill fort, and in 2 weeks, if you besiege a hill fort, maybe it took two weeks to take a hill fort. If you took 20, you could do it in a year, possibly. But I don't know how realistic that is. But there's been lots of campaigns through the centuries where an army has sort of gone through rather quickly because the technology is so good, or the tactics are so good. So it seems that so very quickly, as you said, very quickly, within like 4 or 5 years, the Romans have kind of controlled an area from maybe the Wash down to I guess the Solent, the New Forest area, and a little bit beyond. And then again, within another 20 years, they've pushed north and west, and you could draw a line from the Humber down to Exeter, because you've got Roman fort at Exeter, you've got Roman fort at Lincoln, you've got that Fosse Way going from sort of southeast to northwest, and it seems that was a line that kind of stayed. Now there's a great guy on YouTube, but I can't remember his name either. My memory's like a sieve, and he whilst most people say the Fosse Way was a road, He's saying that that is he thinks it was actually an earthwork, and they built the road on top of the earth or to the side of the earthwork, and he thinks they actually initially built a massive earthwork um, for a time as almost as like a defensive barrier for a time to designate, or defend the bit they held. Um, so at this point, the Brigantes up north, who were allied, they were allied to Rome, as we'll see, because they handed over Caratacus. They might have, who knows what they thought? Did they think, oh, we're kind of like, do they think we're safe up here, or did they think, oh, this is coming, we better be friends with the Romans? Um, but Caratacus definitely didn't. Caratacus carried the fight. He went to the Silures. So the Silures are a completely different tribe in South Wales. But he then fought with the Silures against the Romans. And then you have this steady push outwards. And it was during this steady, as the Romans are pushing their boundary north and west, that you get 17 years later, you get the Romans in North Wales attacking Anglesey and trying to destroy the Druids on Anglesey. And it's during this that you get the Iceni revolt and Boudica. So this is all happening quite quickly, I think. It's only 17 years. And in that 17 years, the Legion, they've built a legionary fort at Colchester, but then they've built a town next to it. And then the Legion was moved. So I think it was the 20th Legion, and it was moved to Gloucester, I think. And then in the end, it ends up at Chester. But at that point, it's kind of, I think it's at Gloucester. And then the 9th Legion has ended up at Lincoln. And the 2nd Legion are now at Exeter. And then there's another legion. There were 4 legions in the initial invasion, but I think one was withdrawn. So I can't remember off the top of my head in 60 whether there were 3 or 4 there. But the town that so they make a colony where you have like the veterans of a legion can retire to, and they're given land and they set it at Colchester and they make this town. But crucially, they don't build a wall around it. They don't protect it at all, and they start treating the locals very badly. And the procurator and the governor are both quite hardcore. Treat the indigenous Britons very badly. So the Britons have got their backs up, and then you get this famous incident where the king of the Iceni dies, and he's bequeathed his land and his tribe to Nero, thinking that gives him protection. But the Romans take that rather literally and say, well, we own it now, so we're taking half of it. And they end up abusing Boudica and raping her daughters. And there you get the Boudican revolt at a time when the governor is in North Wales fighting on Anglesey. And so the Boudican revolt happens. So, and the result of that is, Nero nearly abandons Britain altogether. Apparently, he did consider abandoning it. So that could have been the end of Roman Britain. Could have been a very short-lived thing. But you get the Boudican revolt. They attack Colchester, burn it to the ground. The survivors lock themselves in the temple. Apparently, there was a temple to Claudius. Lock themselves in the temple, and that gets burned. They manage to break in, and they kill everyone in there and burn it to the ground. And then they continue their rampage. The 9th Legion sends a force to confront them. I think first of all, the procurator in London sends 200 men. He gets the message there's problems, so he sends 200 men who promptly get absolutely destroyed. And then the 9th Legion sends a column, and that gets destroyed, and only the cavalry manage to get away. And then Boudican's army gets to London and absolutely destroys London, and you can still see the burnt level today. Apparently, if you dig down into London, you get this darkened earth layer, which is the Boudican revolt. And then they carry on and they get to St Albans, and they burn St Albans to the ground as well, Verulamium. Now this is so the interesting then is where the final battle, Boudica's final battle. People have often tried to put it between London and North Wales. So people have been looking for it up and down the A1 and the M62 and places like that. And they're trying to find this area. But there's a great book by Mackay. Is it Donald Mackay? Recently, Echolands. And he thinks it's actually near St Albans. He thinks it makes sense, as it's an Iceni revolt. They wouldn't have gone too far from their homeland. They're laid down with booty from London and St Albans. St Albans is only 20 miles roughly from London. It's only a day's march from London. So if they destroyed both towns, they'd have been filled with booty. They want to get it back. Um, so it makes sense for the battle to be somewhere near there. And he reckons he's found a place that is in line with the description. So it's a really great book, Echo Lands, and it's quite persuasive. So then the Boudican Revolt, they get the army gets destroyed, and the Romans have gained power. And interestingly, straight after the Boudican Revolt, we think straight after, Vespasian's son Titus, who's about 20 now, he serves in Britain. He comes to Britain as a auxiliary commander, a praefectus of an auxiliary commander, I think, or a tribune in Italy. I can't remember which one. But he comes to Britain. He serves in Britain as an officer. So he's another Roman emperor who set foot in Britain. So then the Romans decide. So there's like terrible reprisals. But after that settles down, Nero decides to withdraw the governor and the procurator, who did a runner from London, funny enough. And he puts in place more kind of liberal-minded governor and procurator who settles things down. And it's interesting, I think, that after the Boudican Revolt, you don't really hear of any other revolt or rebellion in southern Britain, do you? Not really. It's still going on. You're still getting warfare in Wales. You still hear snippets about that, and there's lots up north. And throughout the Roman period, there's always rebellions and incursions and raids from up north. And there's various campaigns in the north all throughout the Roman period from various emperors, not just Septimius Severus. So, but it's interesting. The south is kind of relatively pacified, and the same thing happens in Gaul. So very, very quickly, for want of a better phrase, it's Romanized or pacified. And then you get this whole thing about, well, how Romanized was it? Which hopefully we'll come to later. Is it just a thin veneer? Is it just a plaster that when it's ripped off 300 years later, you just revert back to the tribal entities and tribal identities? Or has it left a legacy? Or is it much deeper than that? Has it changed it irrevocably? So those are really interesting questions. But so in there sort of the next period, the next emperor that turns up is Hadrian. So there's you've got about from 60 to 122. So you've got about 62 years before another Roman emperor turns up. And in that time, you saw roads appear everywhere, towns appear everywhere, towns in the sense that we understand towns, and a whole new economy emerges that's based on towns and based on urbanisation. So yeah, so whilst 90% of the population remains rural, you have now this urbanisation, and a lot of the economy centres around those towns. So it changes the economic life massively, and writing is introduced. The Latin language is introduced, and the Roman style of government is introduced. So whilst they set up civitates, it's based on the tribal areas, but they set up civitates, and the towns become the sort of centres of governance for that particular area within the province. So that's the next bit. And then you get this push north. York, I think York was founded around about 70. You have this civil war in the Brigantes, and the Romans take the side of Catamandia, the queen, and she ultimately wins. And the Romans set a fort up on the border of the Brigantes and the Parisii, which is where York is now. So again, that was a place where there wasn't a town. And initially, the Ninth Legion then moves from Lincoln to York. So the famous Ninth Legion is at York. And then in the 80s, Agricola pushes north. So he pushes north right into Scotland, what is now Scotland. And you have this famous battle of Mons Graupius. And you get this famous speech that Tacitus puts in the words of the Caledonian chieftain about you call it peace and make a wasteland. It's a very famous speech in Tacitus. And then the the Romans win that battle, but then they retreat south. So you've got a point there. So I think Tacitus says Domitian basically threw away the island. The Romans could have conquered the whole of Britain. So you imagine, oh, what would history be like if the Romans had done that as well, and the whole of Britain had been Romanized in the
Would
same
that
way?
have been a desirable thing for them to do, though, or was it more defensible, perhaps, of Hadrian's Wall, because they would have been subject then to raids?
Well, yeah, because it's an interesting question, and I imagine there's all sorts of different opinions about it. Um, because they continued to have trouble from the north all the way through, through Roman rule. So what would have happened if they had stayed there? And then what would have happened? Apparently, he did consider also Agricola. He got to the west coast of Scotland and he can see the north coast of Ireland. He did consider invading Ireland. So he would
Yeah,
run.
so the Irish are invading Britain via Scotland, basically, aren't they?
Well, later on, yeah, certainly. But of course, at that time, all Britain and Ireland were all patchwork of tribes, all invading each other. So they would have quite happily invaded. You know, Romans had like obviously the Romans brought with them a lot of military power, but also a lot of wealth. So it is they
They
are
called
then a
the
target for
Scotti
raid.
at that point, essentially.
The Romans, I'm not sure when the Romans started calling the Irish Scotia. Scotti was it's certainly a phrase they used in the fourth century. Um, the Ireland, so you get one of the Greek writers calls Britain Albiones, and Ireland is like Iverna, which is where you get Hibernia come from. So the Romans at one point would call Ireland Hibernia or Ibernia. Um, but then later on, I think it's later they used the word Scotti for a tribe, when in fact they mean Irish. The Scotti, Northern Irish, and the Scotti come to the west coast of Scotland. And then Bede, you get this idea from Bede that the Scotti, the rider comes from northeast Ireland. Um, so yeah, but he didn't. So he famously didn't. He withdrew, so he's ordered to withdraw. So he withdraws down to what is now Hadrian's Wall, and he builds some forts, and he builds a road going east to west, Stonegate Road. And it's that where 50 years later Hadrian builds Hadrian's Wall. So, but they withdraw south. So they've gone right up into the north of Scotland. Montgrepius is like on the road to Aberdeen. It's like near. It's sort of how far from Aberdeen? 20, 30 miles from Aberdeen. It's in the north of Scotland, and he comes all the way back down to what is now where Hadrian's Wall now sits, and that's where the Romans kind of stay and maintain their barrier. So whether that's because they thought it's just not worth it, it's just too dangerous, or they couldn't hold it, they didn't have enough men. But it's intriguing that even with that, the Roman garrison in Britain was enormous compared to the other provinces. It was enormous. I mean, they kept like 3 legions and 20,000 auxiliaries. They kept more auxiliaries than they did legionaries. So, they had a massive garrison compared to the other provinces. Um, so they must have felt they needed it. Yeah, I mean, obviously the Rhine and the Danube were like points of conflict. In the east, their border with Parthia. Um, so for them to keep a comparable garrison in Britain, especially up north, they must have had a reason. There must have been a lot of pressure from raiding from what is now Scotland and possibly from Ireland as well. Um,
Perhaps
so there's
the diplomacy as well. Add some, basically like a buffer area, maybe.
yeah. Well, the walls. So intriguingly, so there's quite a lot of books about Hadrian's Wall, and I think the modern thinking is it wasn't whilst it could act as a defensive barrier, it was more about control and about controlling flow of people and goods and taxes. So when Hadrian finds so then you get to Hadrian. So in that time, but we get to Hadrian in 122 when he comes to Britain. So the Romans have now been in Britain for 80 years, and in that time, you've got urbanisation across southern and eastern Britain. You've got roads everywhere, and Tacitus says the famous phrase about they've taken they were there, the Britons now wear togas, they drink wine, they think they're civilized, but it's actually the chains that binds them. They think it's civilization, but it's actually their servitude. Um, so Tacitus, yeah, he says some interesting things to Tacitus, and you get that fame. You get I forgot to mention a famous speech by Caratacus whereas Julius Caesar took Vercingetorix back, had his triumph, and strangled him, executed him in front of the people in Rome. Caratacus was captured, by the Brigantian queen and handed over to the Romans. He was taken back to Rome and in chains, and he was going to be executed as well. He'd been sentenced to die. Um, but he gave a speech in the Senate. They brought him before the Senate, and he gave this speech according to the sources, where he says, are you surprised that I fight to defend my mud huts? I've seen your beautiful city now. What on earth do you want with our mud huts and our little island? And are you surprised that I'd fight to the death to keep it from you? And they all applaud him. They think that's great, and they let him live. And Claudian lets him live, and he lets his family settle in Rome. Um, and then you get this interesting. I mean, it's probably gone off a massive tangent, but I've just read a fantastic book about early Christianity in Britain, where the suggestion is so basically this whole idea about King Lucius being the first Christian, kind of very plausible defense of that idea. And he also suggests that the matriarch they were staying with, that Caratacus's children were staying with, was a Christian, and that Caratacus's children were introduced to Christianity. And when they came back to Britain, the Caratacus's children come back to Britain, they introduced Christianity in some parts of Britain. It's a really interesting theory, and I know it crops up in some of the theories that perhaps you're interested in and I've sort of read about.
Yeah, it crops up in the work of Yola Morganog, I think, doesn't it?
Yeah, I know. I find that fascinating. And whilst I like to be skeptical about things, I'm not one just throw things, dismiss things as like, if a source says something, I think that's interesting. I wonder if that's true. I don't think, oh, that can't be
What's the
true.
name of that book, Tony?
Early Christianity of Britain. Green. His name's Green. It is the early Christianity of Britain.
Okay.
Peter Green. Early Christianity in Britain. Peter Green.
Yeah, because there is this, I suppose you could say there's a legend that was reintroduced by Caractacus's children. And does Gildas say as well that Christianity came to Britain in the time of Tiberius? Is that right?
I think he does, yeah, I think he does. And then there's this whole thing about Joseph, about Arimathea and things like that.
Yeah.
So whilst I read things like that, and I think, okay, that might be, maybe it's far fetched, but I don't dismiss it completely. And I tried to look into it, and this book was really good. I mean, it's written by an academic, um, and it was very plausible. And I don't see why, if Bede says there was a King Lucius,
Yeah.
I actually think it's less likely that he's mistranslated the name of some Syrian bloke and some third century pope. I think that doesn't seem a particularly likely explanation.
So what do we know of King Lucius then?
Only that he's supposed. So Bede writes that he sent a letter to the Pope, um, and he was in the second century. So he sent a letter to the Pope and saying basically, can you send some priests to introduce um, Christianity to my people, basically. So, and the sort of the theory is that he did just that, and that King Lucius was the first. So, whatever tribal area he lived in. Um, so yeah, so that's actually very interesting. So I like things like that that can back up what they're saying. And his Peter Green's book is, you know, very plausible. There might well be hosts of historians who will come and say, "Oh no, it's right," and give good reasons why that's not true. And it may be, maybe they're right. Um,
I think I've
but
seen some people try and connect King Lucius to someone we've talked about before, haven't they?
yes,
Certain
yes.
Lucius Artorius Castus.
Well, that can't. That's just no. I don't see that at all. Because Lucius Artorius Castus is a Roman officer. Um, so there's no reason why he would be necessarily a British king. I don't see that at all. And he's a Roman officer with who we know where he served. He's a Roman officer from Dalmatia who served all over the empire. So he's not like someone that just popped up and become a. 'Cause there are certainly cases of tribal chiefs becoming Roman officers. So the Batavian revolt, he was a Batavian prince who became a prefectus of an auxiliary. So he gained Roman citizenship. A bit like Arminius and the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD, and the Germanic defeat of the Romans. He was a Chauci, I think, a Chauci prince, and he was in the Roman army. So you get cases like that. But this guy, Lucius Artorius Castus, he's not one of them. We know perfectly well he is a Roman and he served all over the empire. We got the list of his centurion posts. So yes, there'll be nothing to do with King Lucius. Um, but I am. It does raise an eyebrow, the whole idea about this King Lucius being a Christian in the second century. The reason why some people doubt it is because the earliest evidence of Christianity, I think, in Gaul is in Leon, basically, in about 177. So they think. So I've been reading. I've been getting all the books on early Christian history. I've been reading, and it is amazing how Christianity grew. But whilst we think Saint Paul did travel to Spain, the communities were quite small, and the earliest Christianity in Gaul is 177. So is it likely that we had Christianity in Britain before that? Well, it may not be likely, but it might be possible. I don't see. I wouldn't necessarily dismiss it. I wouldn't say, oh, that's not possible. Anyway, this book by Mr. Green, yeah, I found it very, very good. Uh, until I hear a plausible reason why he's talking nonsense, I will consider that it's quite a reasonable position. So yeah, so that's good. So then you get so you get the Romanization of Britain, and then you get Hadrian. Hadrian comes in. And there's this whole idea that Hadrian, possibly there was a campaign in Britain under Hadrian, because you get I think there's a queen and there's references to an expedition. So there's a one thinking that part of the reason to build the wall was because of an increase in pressure from the north. But Hadrian he built a number of walls. You know, he went to Germania first. He reconstructed the German limes. He built earthworks with palisades on top, constructed that, and then it was the Sixth Legion, who was in Germany at the time, who'd helped construct that. And then because presumably because they had some experience of building a defensive work. Interestingly, it was the legionaries that built things and the auxiliaries didn't. It was quite interesting difference. It seems all the evidence of building works is by legionaries, not by auxiliaries. So
They were like engineers then, were they?
yeah, well, it
Well,
seems to be
engineers.
they had the expertise. So I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why that is, but that seems to be it is like 99% legionaries who are building things. That no doubt changed after the Edict of Caracalla in the first century, when the distinction got a bit blurred. But in the first couple of centuries, there was a clear distinction between the legionaries and the auxiliaries. And the legionaries built things. So you go all along the Hadrian's Wall, it's all built by the second, built by the sixth, it's not built by auxiliary units. But again, it's not to say they didn't do it, but all the evidence suggests it was the legionaries that built things and built the roads and built. So the Sixth Legion come and they get posted to York. And then you get this question, well, where did the ninth go? So the ninth, we don't know what happened to them. You get this whole, all these theories about what happened to the ninth. We think they may have gone back to the continent. But of course, some people were right about they disappeared in the north. We got evidence they're building tiles at Carlisle and places like that. So maybe they went to Carlisle for a while. But we've also got building tiles in Nijmegen, I think it is, and Germany and places like that. So we think possibly some of the ninth was sent to the Rhine, but they certainly had disappeared by 160. So there's a list of legions in Rome, and the ninth isn't on it in 160s. So somewhere between, I think the last dating we got of them are like 110 or something like that. So somewhere between 110 and 160, the ninth disappears, and you get this whole mystery about where they disappeared, and books written about them being destroyed in Scotland, places like that. But anyway, Hadrian orders the building of Hadrian's Wall. Hadrian's Wall is built somewhere between sort of roughly Newcastle and Carlisle. Imagine the lines. It follows the Staingate Road, which is where Agricola had retreated to years before. So you get Hadrian's Wall being built, and that seems to pacify things for a while. And then within 20 years, Antonius Pius comes on the throne, and he orders the legions to push north, and they build the Antonine Wall between the Clyde and the Forth. The Forth, yeah. So they build the Antonine Wall, which seems, when you look at the map, it seems to be an easier place to defend, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
And you do wonder why they retreated. And I have a fear, whilst they, 20 years later, they retreated back to Hadrian's Wall. Most people, sort of like that sort of assumption is that's where it stayed until the end of Roman Britain. But actually, when you read the sources, it does seem it fluctuated back and forth, and sometimes they did push north again. Whether they occupied the actual wall or not is another matter, but it does seem, and you get various emperors who push right into northern Scotland. So Septimius Severus, um, Constantius the First at the end of the third century, Constantine, um, Constance in the middle of the fourth, we think may have had an expedition in Britain, and possibly Stilicho as well. The wasn't an emperor but general, yeah, right at the end. And we have Magnus Maximus defeated the Picts. So there were various back and forths, and I think the whole thing at the end. So Gildas, going back to Gildas, Gildas says that the Picts invaded and captured up to the wall. Well, if they captured up to the wall, that can only be coming from the north. And if they've captured land up to the wall, that suggests the land north of the wall at one point was in Roman or under Roman control. Yeah, that seems to make sense. So that would
Could they have
suggest,
had clients, maybe?
oh yeah, possibly. So, but it does imply that the land north of Hadrian's Wall was under Roman control or allied to Rome.
Yeah.
When
Okay.
you get so things like the Godolphin, the go, I can't say nothing.
Godolphin?
Dobbin, around Edinburgh, um, it would make sense if they were kind of culturally Romano-British, given that they were antagonistic against the Angles of Dara, and they fought against the Angles and possibly fought against the Picts as well. So,
They seem to be of the same culture as, the rest of Britain, don't they?
yeah, and Strathclyde as well. Strathclyde, a British kingdom that survived for several hundred years. Um, so, yeah, so you get Antonius Pius. So he pushes the boundary north through the Antonine Wall, and then 20 years later, they retreat back down to Hadrian's Wall for whatever reason. Okay, um, and then you get Marcus Aurelius coming on the throne, and then there's a mention of problems in Britain in the 160s, but then you get the Parthian War blows up, and he sends Statius Priscus is sent as governor to Britain. I mean, within a few months, they realise they need this experienced veteran to lead their armies into Armenia. So he goes to Cappadocia, takes over the governorship of Cappadocia. I think the former governor had been killed, and then he invades Armenia, and they capture the Armenian capital as the first prong of the war against Parthia. So they have to knock the Armenians out, chase the Parthians out of Armenia, put a Roman client king in charge of Armenia, and then they invade Parthia and defeat Parthia. And that's why you get this campaign in Armenia in 163, and that's where you get, if you go back to Artorius Castus. Some people think that Priscus, if he went to Cappadocia and then invaded Armenia, he would have taken some British troops, and he would have wanted a trusted officer to lead those troops. So he might have taken the camp commander of the Sixth Legion. So that's where Lucius Artorius Castus may have led troops, because his stone says he led troops. And
Yeah.
to
Obviously, recently I spoke to Linda Ray Malcolm, who has a different theory, and she interprets Castus's stone as that he was more or less a sort of de facto governor of Britain. That's how she reads the stone. But this is a different sort of view, I suppose, then.
Well, yeah, because the stone doesn't say he was the governor of Britain. So we know the governors of Britain, and they were all senators. For 200 years, every single governor of Britain was a senator. There wasn't an equestrian, and Castus was an equestrian. So there's no reason for him to suddenly change and put an equestrian. And the stone doesn't say he was a governor. It says he was a commander, Dux, a commander of we don't know how many legions. So it could be two, could be three. Um, and that's all it says. It doesn't say he was a governor. A governor would have a different thing, pro something like that, on the stone. So it's very unlikely. The word dux to mean an administrative commander of some type was fourth century, and this stone is second century, third century. So it's much. It's 200 years later. So we have a dux of Britain in the fourth century in the barbarian, what do you call it, in 367, when the barbarians invaded. Barbarian conspiracy. but we don't have a dux of Britain as a governor in the second or third century. It's just not the governors were all called a certain thing, and he was an equestrian, so he wouldn't have been a governor anyway. She hints that there's a phrase in the Historia Augusta which was written in the fourth century, which I'm not particularly trusted, where there is a suggestion that um, Perennis made put equestrians in charge of the army. Doesn't say he made them governor. Doesn't say that at all. And all the other writers, none of them mention this. They don't mention it, and it would have been a big thing. Putting an equestrian in charge of a major province like Britain would have been a massive thing. It doesn't say that, and this stone doesn't say that. So all the evidence doesn't point that way at all. So I would reject that quite strongly. But the question is, what does ARM against the Armenians? Possibly, if it is Armenia, there's only two major possibilities. One is 163, and the other is 215 under Caracalla.
For
Uh,
those who haven't seen any of the previous videos on Lucius Artorius Castus, there's quite a large lacuna on the stone, so it's a
yeah,
little bit of guesswork involved as to
yeah. So there's a missing. So it says he led. It says he was a centurion in four legions. Then he was a primus pilus. Then he went to be commander of part of the fleet. Praepustus is part of the fleet in Italy. Then he's come back as a praefectus of the Sixth Legion, which in then day at that time usually meant praefectus castrorum. And funny enough, I've written to Professor Tomlin recently, actually, to go through some of the options, yeah, he still said it's Perfectus Castrorum, or Perfectus meant Perfectus Castrorum. It's unlikely to mean anything else at that point. So he was a captain. So he was third in command of the Sixth Legion. So he's not someone you'd put in command of all three legions because each legion had a senator in charge and a senator a second in command. So if one of them died, you'd put one of the others in charge, or you'd get a senator from somewhere else. You wouldn't necessarily give an equestrian over the head of six other equestrian tribunes and two legates in all three legions. It's just not.
could he have been more associated with auxiliary troops, particularly
Well,
the
no,
Sarmatians?
no, because it doesn't say that at all. So the way the Romans, I've just read a great book, Blood of the Provinces, about the auxiliaries, and it's a very specific way the Romans organised their auxiliary troops. So what you'd have is you'd have a prefectus. So for the equestrians had a career path, and you was a prefectus of an infantry unit, then you was a prefectus then you was a tribune in the legion, then you went to be a prefectus of a cavalry unit, that kind of thing. It did change around a little bit at times. So if you was a prefectus of an auxiliary unit, you was a commander of an auxiliary unit. If you was a tribune in the legion, you was a tribune in the legion. Now he wasn't a tribune in the legion; he was a prefectus prostrorum. So he was a commander of the camp. So all his career is legionary. None of it is in the auxiliaries. It doesn't say that on the stone at all. It's very clear that he was in the legion and he was never in the auxiliaries. There are hundreds of stones of people who were in the auxiliaries and then went on to be something else. And it says it clearly on the stone. So he wasn't. And the auxiliaries were separate. So you had infantry units, cavalry units, and mixed units. You had 500 and 1,000 strong, roughly. I mean, the numbers differ slightly. And you have them in all the various forts. So in the north of Britain, you had loads of auxiliaries, and we know where they were stationed, most of them. And the only Sarmatian unit we've got that we know definitely was at Ribchester. And Ribchester's closer to Chester. So if they were attached to a legion, they would have been attached to the 20th at Chester, not the 6th. But the auxiliaries didn't report to the legion, so the auxiliaries reported to the governor in London. So, so they wouldn't have been reported to. If they was on campaign, yes, you'd attach them to a legion. Whoever was in command of the army would be commanding all of them. But in normal times, when they're at the fort, you'd have an equestrian commander of that unit, and then they wouldn't necessarily. If the legate of the local legion turned up and said, "I want you to do this," you'd do it. But um, it's a different rank structure, and he was not in the auxiliaries. He just wasn't. He was in the legions. So there is no connection. You can't say. I mean, you can say, "Oh, we think if he fought a battle, he might have fought with these auxiliaries," I guess, but we don't know that. It's just guesswork. There's no evidence he fought any battles really at all. All we have on the stone is he led British legions, not auxiliaries, British legions against our ARM last letter S. And then the first person who read it saw an E, which is why many people think it's Arminius. If it was Arminius, then it can only be 163 or 215. And if it's not Arminius, some people have suggested it could be Armoricus, so it could be Armorica, but we don't know of any unrest in those times. It could be some other unknown tribal name, the Armani, that bunch,
Mhm.
Armanos or who knows. So Linda's idea of Armatus, which is armed men, is a bit vague, and most historians don't really think that's viable. Armatus Gentus, armed tribes, could be that, but
That's what August Hunt suggested.
yeah, I mean that's a good suggestion. I mean, all imaginative suggestions. Um,
By the way, since talking about August Hunt, I've read his book recently. Hello, August, if you're watching, he'll be on this channel at
oh,
some point in the future.
I look forward to that. Yeah. So in short, most historians do think it's Arminius, and the other reason why it's probably Arminius is because his last appointment was as a procurator of Liburnia. Now Liburnia, and he's got the power of the sword. So he had the power of basically executing people. And that suggests that Liburnia was temporarily carved off of Dalmatia, because Dalmatia was the province and was a sub-province or a province on its own for a time. And the suggestion is the only time that could have happened, or we think that happened, is 170. So during the time of the Marcomanni Wars, when they invaded all the way down to Aquila on the coast, and Marcus Aurelius had to go north and drive them off, and there were battles all on there. You get that famous battle at the start of the Gladiator film. That's all part of the Marcomanni Wars. And Liburnia would have been carved off as a response to that. So that, and there's kind of evidence that possibly it was a province in 167, 170, 168, 170. So that's one. I think, well, that ties in quite nicely to on Armenian campaign in 163, and it ties in quite nicely to him retiring and then maybe having his stone carved in the 180s or 190s, and then dying fairly elderly in his 70s or something like that. So there's that, but there's no reason, of course, we don't know when alive. But so emperors could say ad hoc, I quite fancy giving you a plum job in Liburnia. I'll carve that off, and you can have that for a few years. There's no reason why that couldn't have happened at any time at all. You know, so it's tentative. So we don't know. So we can't date him exactly anyway. So, but definitely, there's no evidence he led any Sarmatians. Um, so there's that. So yeah,
Brilliant. Okay, so back to Roman Britain.
background Britain.
So by the sort of year 180, we can say that up to maybe the Hadrian's Wall or possibly the Antonine Wall,
Yep.
territory was conquered. Was Roman influence then felt consistently in that territory?
Right. Okay. So I think in the past people have kind of suggested that the south and the east was kind of Romanized, urbanized. They kind of had slipped into a different sort of cultural identity, maybe. Maybe it wasn't 100% across everybody. Maybe the peasants on the land were still tilling the land and felt no different. We have no idea whether the tribal identities persisted or how long for. And then in the north and the west, they've suggested that was a militarized zone and it was more about occupation. And the peoples in those areas still felt very strongly um, whatever tribal affiliation they had, and still may have had some antagonistic views about the Romans and the Roman occupation, and still viewed it as Roman occupation. Whereas people in the south might have, the soft southerners, like me, might have felt it was civilization. Um, but of course, we don't know for sure because we don't really know what people felt and thought. We can only say what we see, which is a lot of militarization and a lot of continued militarization all across the north, mainly the north and a little bit of the west as well, but mainly the north and Hadrian's Wall and all the auxiliary forts, and the fact that they kept 20,000 auxiliaries in Britain. I mean, that's an enormous amount of auxiliaries compared to the rest of the empire. And they kept 3 legions here. Um, some provinces only had 1 legion. So it's just interesting that they did that, and they must have done it for a reason. So, but then you get loads of unrest. So you get this incursion in 180s, early 180s. You get this incursion across the wall in the sources, and we do have archaeological evidence of two of the faults on the wall. There's evidence of damage, fire damage, and destruction. So it's tempting to say, okay, well, there's the incursion. They burnt both faults and they've come across in between. And then there's evidence Corbridge, which was like a major site, like depot they had there, um, was attacked and damaged. So of course, it seems logical that that would be a good site for this incursion. So they've come across the wall, they've damaged this site. Cassius Dio famously said that a force was destroyed and the general killed, or the commander killed. Of course, we don't know what he means by that. Does he mean an auxiliary? So each fort had an auxiliary unit in. If they destroyed an auxiliary unit of 1,000 and killed the commander, do they mean that? Does he mean they came to Corbridge and killed whoever commanded Corbridge? Well, that could have been a tribune, because you had part of the Sixth Legion at Corbridge, but it could have been the legate. It could have been the Sixth Legion legate was killed. And it could have been a fault, maybe part of the Sixth Legion. It could be that, but we don't know. Of course, Linda, for example, will insist that it definitely was the Sixth Legion, and the legate was killed, and then Artorius Castus was put in command of the three legions as well. But we don't know any of that at all. All we know is that there's this incursion in the early 180s, according to Cassius Dio, and we have some evidence of destruction that could be dated to that time. So there's that, and then you have the governor at the time, whose name escapes me, was a really hard-nosed guy. He brutally put this down, but his rule over the troops was such that he was very unpopular, and he was brought back to Rome. And then you get this, we think, a temporary governor was it was another senator, but he took over the temporary governorship. And he had another role in Britain. I can't remember what it was. It was Judicus, that was it. So he was like you had the procurator, which was an equestrian financial. He was in charge of the finances and the taxes. And you had the governor, who was a senator. And then you had this guy who was in charge of like the legal administration side. And he would have been a senator. And he took temporary command. So it's interesting. They didn't give it to the equestrian. They gave it to this senator. And then you get Pertinax, interestingly. So Pertinax is another emperor. He was an emperor after Commodus. And Pertinax had been in Britain. He'd served in Britain. I think he served as a tribune in the Sixth, and he served as an auxiliary commander on the wall. Possibly at Housestead. I can't remember off the top of my head. So he'd gone through the equestrian career path, and then he'd been made a senator, and then he'd come back as a governor. So you see there's another reason why they wouldn't have an equestrian. You see their clear career path. He's made a senator, and then he comes back as a governor. And the troops, just before he comes back, the troops try and appoint this other guy, another Priscus, not the same guy, another Priscus. They try to appoint him as emperor. They try to rebel against the emperor, who's Commodus at the time. And he basically says, no, I'm not an emperor any more than your soldiers, or something like that. So he then gets withdrawn and gets sent, I think he gets sent to the Rhine. And then they send Pertinax, and Pertinax, brings in a bit of discipline, which they don't like. And there's a rebellion, and Pertinax is nearly killed. A lot of his staff are killed, and he's found among the dead, but he manages to survive. And he comes out of Britain, and we don't know who was governor then. We've got a little bit of a gap. We think there was a gap. And this is where Linda likes to put Artorius Castus in this gap. And then you get Claudius Albinus, who is also a senator. So you have all these senators. So it's unlikely there will be an equestrian in that gap. So Claudius Albinus is made governor. In the meantime, Commodus, a year or two later, ends up being murdered in the bath, and Pertinax is made emperor. And then Pertinax, 3 months later, is murdered by the Praetorian Guard. And then you get this. This is when many people say this is the turning point in the Roman Empire, where you get this. Basically, who was the next guy? Didius Julianus, I think it is, and there's another guy, and they're basically at the gates of the Praetorian Guard. One of them's inside, tied up with a knife to his throat, and the other one's outside, and they're basically auctioning off the throne. The Praetorian Guard are. So one of them says, "I'll give you whatever 20,000 sesterces," and then the guy outside says, "I'll give you 30," and it goes back and forth. So the sources are saying this is a disgraceful moment in Roman history, that where the throne was debased, and it was sold off to the highest bidder. And Didius Julianus basically wins, and he becomes the emperor. Now, at which point, there's three very powerful generals dotted about the empire. There's Prosennius in Syria, there's Septimius Severus on the Danube, and there's Albinus, Claudius Albinus in Britain. And they all say, well, actually, we want to be emperor as well. So they all declare themselves emperor. And Septimius Severus is closer. He marches on Rome. And Didius Julianus, at the last minute, tries to do a deal. Septimius Severus, well, he's not having any of this. So Julianus ends up getting murdered rather pathetically in the palace, saying, "What have I ever done?" Something like that. His last words. And Septimius Severus basically gets all the Praetorian Guard, strips them all, and basically threatens them with all sorts of things and disbands them, and sets up a new lot for their disgraceful behaviour in killing Pertinax, who was his friend, and who was a good emperor, who was well regarded by the Romans, or by the sources anyway. And he does a deal with Albinus, that Albinus will be his heir, and he turns on Prosennius. And in this civil war, Prosennius is killed. So Septimius Severus is now the main guy. He's the emperor. And he a couple of years later, he declares his son, or both sons, or one of the sons, Caracalla, I think, the eldest son, he declares him his heir. So Albinus is in Britain is like, hang on, I've been had. So he then rebels, and this is the only time where the legions in this period, in this like 200-300 year period, where the legions are taken to the continent. He takes the legions from Britain. He takes his army to Gaul, and Septimius Severus comes north, and they meet at Lake Dunham, just the other side of the Alps in southern Gaul, which is now the city of Lyon, where a number of emperors, funny enough, make their end. And there's a massive battle. So this is a massive turning point in Roman history. And the sources say it was like one of the biggest battles in history. It's like 100. They say 150,000 men on both sides, which is like that would be the entire Roman army. So it's unlike. So maybe it was 150,000 across both armies, which is believable. 70,000 maybe on both sides. So maybe Claudius took maybe 30,000 from Britain, and then he took troops from Spain and Gaul. And Septimius Severus had all his Danube and Rhine armies and Italian armies. And there's this massive battle, and Septimius wins, and Albinus gets killed. So Septimius Severus is now the undisputed heavyweight title winner. He's in charge in Rome. And whilst I've seen a few YouTubes about him being the first African emperor. He was born in North Africa, but he's I think one side was Italian, and his mother's side, I think his mother's side was Phoenician, which is Syrian. Although the Phoenicians had cities initially in North Africa and Spain, so he would have been very Mediterranean looking. You know, he wouldn't, as some people have said, be like the first black emperor. He would have looked Mediterranean, as most people do. Yeah, if you look at a Tunisian and an Italian and a Spanish, you probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference. And North African, yeah, or Egyptian. Of course, Egyptians, Cleopatra was Greek. It was Greek descent, so she would have been white. So anyway, so Septimius Severus is now in charge. He's got his two young sons. We get then to 208, and there's another incursion in the north. So there's an incursion in the 180s. 20 years later, there's another incursion, and the governor sends a lot of I'm in real trouble here. I've had to buy them off, the Matai, and the Caledonians. So the Matai were between the Clyde and the Forth, and the Caledonians were in the far north. And he buys them off, and then there's more trouble. So Septimius Severus, the way the sources describe it is he's on his last knockings. He's had a prophecy that he's going to die soon, and he quite fancies another fight. Really, he just thinks this is my last throw of the dice. I'm going to go. I'm going to go to Britain, and my two sons, my two wayward sons, who I can imagine they're kind of teenagers at this point, and if you've got teenagers.
Yeah,
But perhaps
not
a bit of
quite.
discipline. Perhaps a bit of discipline might do it. And pull your trousers up while you're at it. Well, I wouldn't have been wearing trousers at the time, but as I'm teaching in schools now, and you see the number of kids with trousers down by their knees, pull your trousers up. So these two wayward sons, he decides they need a bit of discipline. A good campaign will do them a world of good. So he takes them on campaign. So at this point, because in 211 they're 22 and 21, I think. So in 208 they're like 3 years, so they're late teens, they're like 17. So he takes them to Britain. So he sets up at York, and then he marches north, and then he has these campaigns in the north. And this is where when I wrote about like, Lucius, Artorius, Castus, my theory was that perhaps because the stone has a double F on the praefectus, this is probably unlikely because it might be a stonecutter's mistake, but it could mean he commanded two camps, and of course, or multiple camps, and of course there were multiple camps because they built camps all over Scotland as they were invading, or he shared camp commander with someone else or a number of people. That's an explanation for the double letters, and it is a time when you would have led legions north into the north against the Caledonians. And then it ties in with Caracala's Armenian campaign a few years later. So that was my theory, but I'm not sort of 100%. I wouldn't say I'm definite. It's just a theory. So you have this major campaign, and they can't bring them to battle. If you read the sources, there's no sort of major pitch battle, so you don't get a Mons Graupius like Agricola did. But it's a war of attrition, and supposedly they lose in this whole war they lose 50,000, which is an enormous amount. But people have suggested it's an exaggeration, which again I don't know. Yes, if the sources say something, I don't always think, oh well, that can't be true. I think, well, that might be true. I wonder if it was true, how could it be true? So 50,000 men is obviously a lot of men. So it's more than the garrison of Britain. But he took men over from the continent, so we know he took men into Britain. So he took more soldiers, and he would have used whatever was in Britain as well. Um, so he kind of will. He brings them to a point where they have to make an agreement, and you get this famous conversation between whilst he's talking with the chief. The chief's wife is talking to Septimius Severus's wife. They're having this conversation. You get this insight where she says, "I don't understand you, Britons. There's this whole thing about they sleep." They sleep with anybody. They're allowed to sleep with anybody, whoever they like. You sleep with whoever you like. You're not faithful to your husband. You're not dutiful. You're not like chaste like Roman women are, and blah 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 blah. And the British Queen says, "Well, I don't understand you Romans. We sleep with the best of our men whenever we want, whereas you seem to sleep with the worst of yours." Something like that. Which is a nice riposte, which Dio obviously delights in saying for whatever reason. Um, so they have this agreement, which the Britons probably break. So Septimius Severus says is a very chilling part of Cassius Dio, where he says, "That's it. We're not going to leave a woman or child alive. We're going to go. We're going to kill every living thing. Not even a babe in the womb will we leave alive." And it seems that he was true to his words because you don't hear a peep out of Britain for like 100 years. He does seem to have pacified Britain for quite a long period of time. Um, so Septimius Severus promptly dies in York, and his sons are then co-emperors, Caracalla and Geta. Geta's a couple of years younger. Caracalla hates his brother with a passion, apparently, like pathological passion. And they race back to Rome together with their mother, trying to pacify him and build bridges. And they get to Rome and they end up carving up the palace into two halves so they don't have to see each other. And they end up carving up the empire into two halves so they don't have to deal with each other. And then the mother tries to consolidate, bring them together. And then eventually Caracalla um, basically says to him, okay, we'll make an agreement. And, and he's basically lying. He's doing this just to get his hands on Geta. And he ends up, they have this meeting in front of their mother, and he kills his brother in front of the mother, murders him, and then races to the Praetorian camp and gets them to support him and call him emperor. So this is the Severans. The Severans were a nasty, horrible bunch of people. But it's a good turning point for us. It's for the first half of the, not only is it a turning point in the empire, but in terms of the story of Britain, Caracalla famously, the first division of Britain, we think, happened under Caracalla. So they divide the diocese into two provinces. And now you've got a governor in both. You've got the southern and you've got the northern province. And he introduces his Edict of Caracalla, where he makes everybody a citizen of Rome. So whereas before only citizens could be in the legions, and the auxiliaries, whilst citizens could join the auxiliaries, it tended to be non-citizens. So you'd get sort of Germanic mercenaries and people like that serving in the auxiliaries, and their prize was they would get citizenship after 25 years. So you'd have Britons joining the auxiliaries as a route to citizenship. So all the elites would be made citizens possibly, but the people wouldn't have been citizens necessarily. But the Edict of Caracalla changes all that. And so some people might naively think, oh, he's very egalitarian, he's making everyone a citizen, but actually it just increases the tax base, and that's
Right.
I think Castus Dio suggests that's the main reason why he did it. He just wanted to make it easier to tax everybody and get more money.
So
But
we can say, is that the first half of the presentation
I
then? Is
think
that
so, yeah, and so it also worth saying it breaks the link between the legions and the auxiliaries. So the legions and auxiliaries were two different institutions, and the main difference was citizenship. And it breaks that link because if everyone's a citizen now, then all the auxiliary, why are they in the auxiliaries? They're in the auxiliaries to get citizenship, but now you just give them citizenship. So it kind of breaks that link. So the distinction between the legions and the auxiliaries just become blurred, and eventually they kind of disappear altogether. But yes, it's a good turning point.
so everything changes after that, and the story gets even more interesting, in my opinion, in the late Empire. So
Yeah,
we'll pick that up next time. Thanks very much for that, Tony. Brilliant speaking to you again, and we'll cover the later Roman Empire in the next video.
lovely. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank
Right.
you.